Hello there. Ian has come for some more tutorials on this matter of making drama work in the classroom. And today we have a guest with us, Mrs. Varley. Bea works at the Cape School, a primary school, and she has actually been working in this method with 2 classes of children. And I thought it would be a good idea for Ian and Bea to meet so that she can share with him something of what she's been learning about as she's worked on these projects in her school. So we have Bea's class here represented, and of course we have the work that you've been doing represented. Now this first class we're going to discuss, and Ian can see what's happening, is based upon a rather tragic tale of Mary Morgan, a young woman who was hung in the 19th century for killing her child. And of course, as Ian knows, that in this work you have to frame the children so that they carry some responsibility within the work, and this drives the work forward. In the case of the Mary Morgan work then, Bea took the idea that the children would be detectives. This would be their frame of reference throughout. How can we possibly understand the mystery of how a young woman, under her living circumstances, could kill a small baby? And of course the material sounds a bit horrendous, but in fact the mystery was looked at through these 2 gravestones on one grave, one seeming to condemn her and one seeming to forgive her. And we felt this was something the children could handle. So the material is historical in one sense, but it was really based in language, wasn't it? Because it was the language and the reading particularly you wanted to begin to work quite seriously on with
Very much so.
the children. Before we discuss how it worked, let's just have a look at some of the things the children used then from the beginning. The first thing they had were 2 representative gravestones, which Bea has just written up in this way, but the original stones that they worked on were on black paper with the proper kind of lettering that we see here in these photographs. And of course they have been to see the gravestones, haven't they?
Yes, we took them to Prestine on a
yes,
trip.
Yes, yes. And the other reading material they were presented with was this set of created archives. They are not original archives. They have been made by a teacher for the sole purpose of creating reading material of a very direct kind, but also a very complex kind. Now these archives are of 2 kinds, aren't they? One is from the actual court proceedings, statements made by the judge and so on, evidence of who the jurymen were at her trial, and others have been invented with a more human element to them. The carter who took Mary Morgan to the big house when she was 12 or 14, when she first began to work there. So this is from the point at which we began. Now I know you, Bea, had some doubts about this gruesome material.
I had tremendous doubts at the beginning because I thought to myself, when I had the offer that Dorothy was going to come into school and show us how drama can work in the primary classroom, I thought, wonderful. And then came the bombshell. We'll be investigating this material. Well, I hadn't dealt with death before, and I most certainly hadn't dealt with murder. I mean, I've been just really chuntering along with sort of, the normal topics one would do. And I was just absolutely horrified. I thought, what am I going to do? I could see my own professional funeral coming about, thinking, what are the parents going to say? How are the children going to take it? But eventually, having spoken to Dorothy, you put my mind at rest.
Well, I was glad of the warning, because you see, I hadn't realised what an interracial class you have here, what a mixed racial class.
Yes.
And I could realise your fears suddenly. I mean, with Muslim children and Sikh children, and you're the expert now on whether we should go ahead with this kind of
It's very
material.
daunting, isn't it, to think that the conventions that exist in the classroom could well be broken, and you don't know what you're going to land yourself in for. Well, that's what worries me, anyway.
Well, it's breaking those conventions, believe me, where you get the best work. It's been a wonderful experience for me. It really has.
Well, I appreciate you saying that. You see, I know, and this is my problem, or at least Bee's problem with me, I know everything will work. I know there is no material based in human ideas and concerns that will not work because the teacher plans it carefully and very tactfully. This is what we've been on about the whole time. Now, what we need to look at then is how did Bee make this work with this class of children? I believe they were mixed ability. They are mixed ability.
Very much so, very much so. But very enthusiastic, extremely enthusiastic. And this came about through the material. I learned an awful lot about the class, which I'm sure I wouldn't have done had I just followed conventions and, you know, the way that I'd been working before.
Later we might look at some of the changes that came about in you, because obviously you would approach a lesson in a rather different format with this system than you would normally have approached it. Now there are 3 questions I have to ask Bee so that she can help Ian understand. My 3 R's, as Ian knows, are the children, can we say all the time they are working with rigour? No messing on. Is the work functioning for the purpose for which you intended it? The second thing is it creating responsibility in those children for the quality of their work and towards the material? In this case, the life of a young woman who has been dead long, long before they were born. And the third thing is the nature of how the work progresses, creating in the children a realization of what they now know. Because if we don't reach this stage, Ian, we've been messing around, having only responsibility for it, without them being able to say, this I now understand because I've done this. So those are the 3 things. And I don't know whether you feel that in the work you did, there have been moments when you can say, yes, they did realise something. I mean, have you got an example?
Well, 2 examples that spring to mind for the rigour, first of all. The reading from the gravestones. When I first saw them, my initial reaction was, they'll never ever be able to cope with the language that's on there. But
especially if some of it's missing, because the grave was old and not all the words
that's
in
right.
it.
But actually seeing them just crowd around the gravestones, and they were reading together, and they were all concentrating, all of them, every single one, even those that couldn't read, because I have 2 or 3 children in the class who have tremendous problems with reading. But they were so engrossed by it. And they were reading all together and trying to make sense. And Dorothy was saying to them, well, let's just read on and see what this actually means in the context that it's presented. So that was one example of the rigour. And another example was the way they ploughed through the archives. The language was difficult. I mean, it's adult language. You don't normally present that type of language to 8-year-olds.
When you look at some of this, Ian, you see you can't muck about with it. If you're really using evidence, you're using evidence. And we have here, you see, she set about the awesome task of delivering her baby, racked with pain and suffering, and confused with the worries of finding support and maintenance. Asking children to penetrate this is a moral issue for you. You may say, no, this is not to be dealt with. But if I remember that first lesson, those children saw the word suffered there and immediately looked at child abuse.
Yes.
Now, in my day as a child, I wouldn't have even known about that.
And rape also came up.
And rape
Yes.
came up, yes, and they were 8, were they? Or
8 at the time.
years old. And so we see already how it's a diagnostic tool. You've got some material there as a result, have you, of this,
Yes,
this archive material?
normally, if you're presenting children with material like this, it usually goes in a sort of linear progression. You know, you sort of start at the beginning, it's nicely sequenced, and everything follows a pattern. The children were presented with the archives in a very random fashion, and so they were divided into groups, and they all had to make sense from the material that they were presented with. Now, this is an example of what a group did about the birth certificate. They had to obviously read very difficult language there, but something that sprung to mind that I wanted to share with you was the fact that because they were dealing with vocabulary that was slightly above them, one of the children's sucklip actually wrote here that, to my coordination, she obviously wants to use you know, words that she wouldn't normally use. Okay, she's got it wrong, but I now know that I've got to help her with that and tell her what kind of a context she could use it in. They
But
spend...
she's also there picked up a legality element.
Yes,
You see,
language
she's
for the
using an
purpose.
actual to my phrase that probably she would never start a sentence with to my.
Well, she wouldn't have been
Normally.
exposed to it.
No.
She wouldn't have been exposed to it had it not been through, you know, material like this. And another example of the rigour was when the children divided into groups and had to analyse the archives. I mean, it took 2 or 3 days for them to just sift through the information at their leisure at the time, discussing an awful lot of group cooperation to finally come out with something like this and get the sort of poignant facts that were in the archives, like Mary Morgan killed her baby with a penknife. You know, she got the penknife from a shop and nearly divided the head from the body. I mean, the
Which,
facts
of course,
are there.
is pretty horrendous statements, but they found it in the archive. You see, again, you come back to your own sense of what is right for a teacher to do. I can't advise you, and I certainly wouldn't presume to advise you. I know that there will be no horror when I deal with it. Not the horror of a television image. There will be the compassion to understand how it might have been for such a lady under those circumstances. But you make your own choice. The problem is that frequently we choose the bland choice, and this makes an even larger separation in children's lives from what they may see around them or what they may see on the television. So school seems even more unreal in the material we present them with. It would never be my first choice to do this, but the problem of the gravestones was what attracted me, and the fact that the children could go to Preston and share something of why there are flowers put on this grave all the time, who puts them on, because that is a very compassionate thing that seems to be going on all the time in Preston. So to me, that made it possible to use this other material. Now, we taught a specific series of introductory lessons, and I'd like you to have a look at these with Ian, and you can keep me right if I've forgotten any. I've written them down because I need to remind myself, because we're looking always at what was going on in the children's learning during that time. So imagine a group of children grouped round a blackboard, and the question they've been asked, and interrupt me if I'm wrong here in my memory of it, they were asked, what do you think you have to do if you work like a detective? So we have a big discussion. The children were socially superb here. They could hear one another, they listened to one another, they didn't condemn each other, they were not laughing at each other. Errors of spelling, they did their own writing on the board, and so on. That was me finding out, can these children work together and this will always be a problem for you. When you first tackle this, how are they socially? According to the paradigm, you see,
Yes.
they are normally expected to work with. So the first thing is orientating and limbering up about the thing. The second thing, they had to tackle reading the gravestones. Now that's a totally different skill and another kind of diagnosis for me. They then, and this may seem very odd to you, they started to make a town map. Now you see, it's what you said, it doesn't follow on in a normal, when we've read these gravestones, what would be the sensible thing? Interiorly, the sensible thing is to make the town map, because where are these graves located? If they really exist, they have to be somewhere. So making a town map is a way to make a cemetery. Come in sideways. When they've made the town map and they place the church and the cemetery, we then have them deciding, because they have to live here now to be part of this, who are we? What are all our shops? What sort of people are we? What is life like living here? So making that town map triggered off a whole tremendous area of curriculum work. The next stage we went through was the new vicar, because the new vicar coming causes you to have to explain where the church is from the station and what the cemetery looks like. I know in the real world the vicar would have been earlier, but he couldn't have been earlier in our classroom because we only started this morning. And so orientating the vicar through the drawn streets, past all the shops, is slowly building a feeling of we live here. Very, very gently. It's not happening yet, but it's beginning to, isn't it? You could see that with that. And so they did a guided tour for the vicar. But of course the vicar then made the relationship with the gravestones, with his cemetery key, which was deliberately chosen to be either a fantasy or a reality at first. They creaked, do you remember? They creaked the gate open. It hadn't had any WD-40 on it for years and years and years. And that became quite a feature. So now we have the vicar, the cemetery, the gravestones, and we live near there. Now that's what I call the internal coherence of the series, you see. Then we began to see what the graves would have written on them. So the children made gravestones. I believe you've got some there. And we begin to look at the language of gravestones, because you don't just write any old thing. There's a style to these things, and so on. And this raised further questions about Mary Morgan, because the vicar had never heard of her. Actually, we'd only heard of her that morning. But we talked as if we knew an awful lot about her, though in fact we knew nothing, except we'd pondered a lot on her suffering and what it meant to suffer. Did you get any surprises?
I was absolutely amazed at what they were coming up with. It certainly sort of brought out the multicultural element of my classroom. Like, for example, in this graveyard, Nazat, one of my pupils, wrote, Michael Stewart, aged 90, died in March 1810. He liked naan bread.
That's fascinating, isn't it? Yes.
It really personalised, you know, this...
Yes. Now this is an example of septic teaching. You remember we've been discussing antiseptic and septic. And this is what you get with septic teaching. Antiseptic teaching, you wouldn't put that on a grave.
No.
It wouldn't be proper.
No.
Except it's what people do put on graves.
And their experience of life, basically. Memory of Julie Peake, died from drugs, 1807. You know, which really put my mind at rest, because I thought to myself, oh my goodness, they know so much more than I credited them with, because, you know, they know about the social ill health of society. You know, so what was I, really worrying about, because we were going to do death.
Yes.
I mean, it was all there, you know, drugs, smoking, heart attacks, AIDS, there you go, yeah, AIDS, yeah.
It's another example of the diagnostic power of this. As long as we don't leap immediately to conclusions about everything, that we get insights that are normally hidden. You remember I said in an earlier tutorial, Ian, that you are inviting the authentic behaviour of children. And this is how it shows itself in this particular case of the making of the stones.
It tells you where they're at right now.
Yes, yes. And their relationship with death, with regard to AIDS and so on. And then this other relationship with death, which is to do with the girl having to get rid of a baby, an unwanted baby. You wonder, in fact, I wonder if your class now have paid special attention to the Irish situation, you know, at this moment, because they may well be with the girl who has had to have the abortion and all the court business, because it would strike them, I'm quite sure, into relating with their schoolwork. I don't know what you think about that.
Well, what they keep coming up with now is just phenomenal. I mean, every time something happens on the news or in the papers, they're forever bringing in snippets of information. You know, don't you think this relates to Mary Morgan? And this is just like, in fact, they watched, it was Adam Bede, I can't remember now the title of the film, but there was something very, very similar in the film about a woman having to murder her child. And straight away the next day, crowds of them round my desk. Did you see it? It was just like Mary Morgan. So
was it salacious? Did you regard it as a dangerous thing that you'd done then, or not?
Oh, not at all.
You really are convinced of that?
I'm absolutely convinced.
Because I know teachers do worry about the content of the material, don't they? But frequently we mistake bland things that really are horrific if you go into them. It's so easy, you see, in words to say, and she cut her heel off so that the slipper would fit. Tell it as a lovely fairy story and it doesn't sound like horror at all. But Cinderella is full of that sort of cruelty and horror and deception, isn't it? But it doesn't seem so blatant as this, because
it's well hidden, isn't it?
Called a fairy story. Yes. And of course every teacher must decide what they're prepared to penetrate. We protect children into experience. We don't protect them out of it. We protect them into it. And therefore we are the judge of what we are prepared to do. We're responsible for our choices. And of course human affairs range from the most heroic, splendid acts to the most sordid. And you draw your line where you will, as you must have found, as you found yourself. We then had to visit the archives, the local archives with the vicar, because he needed to know more about Mary Morgan. And so this again, it seems to be jumping about, but it's not. We're always in reading. We're always in the language that's coming from this historical material that we've begun with. And of course, we then we develop further then I've lost my last page. Here we are, you see. We then begin to consider what kind of life must Mary Morgan have lived up in the big house. Who were her friends? Did she miss her parents? And so on and so on. And the material that would come available now in these terms, I don't know if you've had time to do anything of that, if they've looked at, you know, what life was like for her.
No, that's the next thing that we're going to do.
That's the next thing you're going to do. All the time, we are looking at how do you ask questions to get information, not how do you sit back and teachers give it to you. What can we initiate ourselves?